Hello subbies, welcome to our stream. I hope that you're all having a good week so far. I know that we haven't seen each other too much this week. I took some time off of Twitch due to some things that have been going on recently. Some of you may know about those things, but if not, we are going to talk about them here shortly in a minute. You will learn about them then. But yes, I hope that you're all well. I hope that everything has gone good for you in terms of the recent holidays and your week also. Okay, so purpose of today's stream is that we are going to talk a little bit about some of the recent stuff that's happened in the VTuber community and just kind of detail some rules about consent in interactions and also how to have proper interactions with viewers and how viewers can have proper interactions with the streamers that they follow. Dakota, thank you so much for the follow. This is going to be a very... I don't want to say the word serious because I'm going to be presenting it in a way that I hope feels a little bit easier to take in, but it is going to be a very detailed conversation. So this might be different from what you've come to expect of me. But I feel it's necessary. Because with all the repeated callouts, with all the repeated details of abuse, friends of mine being abused, and just the negative, just the bad things that happen in the VTuber community, just all the really unnecessary, horny tweets that are just there to make people uncomfortable, unless you're in the in circle with that person. Just all of that. This is about all of that. All right. I'm gonna stop prefacing it and just let it speak for itself. All right. Let's get started. So our topic for today is the importance of consent and proper interactions in the VTuber community. I put my Twitter handle on this because I didn't want to put the name Domiwoof on it just because that felt silly. I wanted this to be as serious as possible because this is a serious subject. It's not something to be lighthearted about. It's not something to joke about. And it's something that a lot of people take for granted. And it's something that a lot of VTubers do wrong. So I just wanted the subject matter to be as clear and concise as possible. Actually, I'm even going to take Wolfer off the screen because I want everybody to be able to see the content. Alright, so what is the topic for today's discussion? The purpose of this discussion is to briefly highlight why consent matters and how it can affect the interactions you have with fellow content creators and your audience as a whole. This is particularly important to me because I've built a platform on recognizing consent. I've also been studying themes of rape, sexual assault, and sexual abuse for much of my academic career, which ended in 2020. A lot of you who follow this channel already know this. I am a criminal justice major. I have 2 degrees in criminal justice and psychology. I even have a master's in psychology. I finished my study in psychology as a master's student in 2020, right as coronavirus began. And the only reason I didn't become a psychologist is because coronavirus shut down the state licensing systems. That led to me becoming a VTuber. The reason why I wanted to highlight my credentials in this is to let you know that this information isn't coming from somebody who's an expert, but it is coming from somebody who has written and researched these subjects. I'm not going to say that I am somebody who is the end-all be-all authority on things like consent, but I will tell you that I have written at least I don't even know how many. At least 8, maybe 10 papers on the topics of sexual assault, sexual abuse, and rape throughout my entire academic career. Probably more than that, considering graduate work was all writing. I'm generalizing. But anyway, I wanted to present that in this way. I do encourage people who watch this presentation to do their own research as well. Not only are we going to be providing resources so that people can read the original things that sparked this conversation, but I am going to be providing a resource to the RAIN website so that people can learn about consent and sexual assault and sexual abuse and the proper ways to identify those things, and also what to do if you fall victim to those things at the end of this presentation. So what happened? On Tuesday, a number of female VTubers came out about abusive relationships they had with their fellow content creators. One of these people was a fairly prominent member of the community, while some others were personalized. No names are going to be used during this presentation, but resources will be provided at the end to elevate victim voices. After the initial callouts, several others came out, but curiously there are also voices of people who wanted to make the issue about men, a sentiment that was not shared by the people who originally made the callouts. The targeted effort to make the callouts about male VTubers in specific resulted in a wildfire, causing male VTubers to get attacked in DMs and on posts about the subject. This further resulted in incendiary comments about male VTubers being the main problem with these callouts, completely missing the point and drowning out the original message. The purpose of these callouts was to make victims of sexual abuse, sexual assault, and adultery heard. The offenders were primarily male, but the point wasn't to make it about all male VTubers, it was simply to document cases of abuse. It appears, based upon these comments and others, that the VTuber community as a whole has difficulty understanding the concept of consent. Seeing as how I consider the majority of my platform about BDSM, a practice which almost inherently relies on consent, I felt it might be beneficial as well to have a dialogue about that. So what is consent? The Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, RAIN, defines consent as an agreement between participants to engage in sexual activity. But not all consent is sexual. Social consent exists too. There are 4 main types of consent. The first one is explicit consent, where consent is granted through words or through writing. An example of explicit consent is when you say, yes, I want to do this to somebody, or when you say, no, I don't want to do this. Implicit consent, where consent is granted by means of an action. For example, if you follow an R18 content creator on Twitter, you are consenting for that content creator to post their content on your timeline. That is implicit consent. Informed consent, where consent is taken ahead of time through a form, a post, or a notification. For example, an R18 creator posts a poll on their page letting people vote if they can post nudes of themselves. Depending on the answer, they might do it. They are assuming that because they have provided the informed consent agreement, that the people who voted on the poll or might follow them are aware of this being done, so the informed consent has been granted. And unanimous consent, which is it's a term that's more unique to politics, but it does happen in social situations as well. It's a situation where consent is taken based upon social cues. For example, you might be in a group of friends who are talking, and they might bring up a sexual topic, and since nobody outright speaks out against that topic, it just might be inferred that everyone's okay with talking about it. Very important. Consent is not a universally provided rule. It can be reclaimed as well as granted. For example, let's say you have a friend you flirt with and exchange nude pictures with, but you stop talking to them. When you come back 5 months later, that consent could have changed, because they may no longer feel comfortable with this exchange. Consent can be asked for verbally through permission. Example, is this okay? Are you comfortable with this? Or it can be asked for with nonverbal cues, nods or gestures which indicate proceeding. Implicit consent can be granted through other means, without the use of words or any affirmative indicators. For example, let's say you have a job review where your boss rates your performance as average, but doesn't outright fire you. You might consider, because you have your job still, that they've provided implied consent to keep you. Implied consent is a term that's used a lot in contract law, so it tends to refer to things in those terms of service agreements that Apple provides, for example, or the type of contract you might fill out if you're taking out a loan. Things like that are classified as implied consent. It is implied that consent continues up until the point where the person clearly states the word no, but this is a very naive way to think about consent, and this is often the way that I think the VTuber community thinks about consent. In actuality, if a person displays any sort of discomfort or hesitance, that is where consent ends. As a content creator, it's your duty to recognize this in your audience. If you're an R18 content creator, you're responsible for recognizing this in people you interact with. I see this happening a lot on Twitter. There's a lot of lewd content creators that I follow who repeatedly post extremely sexual memes about their audience. You've probably seen them yourself if you go on Twitter a lot. There are those, if you retweet this, then we're fucking memes. Those are, in my opinion, a very bad thing, because when you retweet that, you are technically infringing on your audience's right to consent to it. And because you may not be familiar with everyone in your audience, by retweeting something like that, you might actually seriously offend somebody to the point where they might consider their limits violated. Most importantly, no means no. If anyone tells you no at any point in time, regardless of a justification, regardless if it's just simply to say that they're not into it right now, any sort of pushback means no. Do not do it under any circumstances. Viewer interactions versus creators. As a viewer, your consent with a content creator can be granted in many ways. For example, if a content creator flirts with you and you flirt back, you have provided implicit consent that the act of flirting is okay. However, this does not universally mean that the content creator has unbreakable consent to continue flirting with you. The consent lasts for that specific moment. A lot of content creators, like myself for example, frame their content in a very specific way. I'll speak about me more than anybody else here. I make my branding off of BDSM, implications of sex, and various kink-related content. My impression is that if you are following this channel, you are aware of that. It doesn't mean that I'm going to flirt with you. It doesn't mean that I'm going to be sexual with you. It means that you understand that there's going to be content of a sexual nature on this channel, and that it might have to do with kink. That is what you have consented to. Now then, if we're having a conversation during a stream, for example, and things get a little heated up to the point where I start flirting with the audience, I do that based upon implied consent that the audience is okay with it. It's not saying that I feel a certain way about the audience, or that, say for example, I want to engage in any sexual interactions with them. It's just flirting at that time. And you may notice I have a habit of not continuing that type of thing unless it comes up again. Consent is a very situational thing when it comes to creators. Viewers have every right to say no. If you don't want a content creator to flirt with you, or you consider their advances negative, you're allowed to say that. This is especially true in a public space like Twitter or on a Twitch stream. I'm going to go so far as to say, if you are uncomfortable with my interactions on my stream, you have every right to tell me no. You have every right to tell anybody no that you're watching. If a streamer is making comments to you that you find offensive, inappropriate, or just make you feel gross and violated, you have every right to tell that person no. And if they reject your right to say no, then you have every right to stop watching them, you have every right to unfollow them, to block them, to call them out, whatever you need to do. The moment a person refuses to say no is the moment they have infringed on consent. Sorry, I wrote that wrong. The moment a person refuses to acknowledge no is the moment they've infringed on consent. Conversely, you as a viewer must also understand that content creators have to consent for you to make sexually suggestive comments to them, or infringe upon their limits. I have said multiple times on this channel that I am fine with people flirting with me. I don't care what you say to me. The point at which it becomes a problem is when you start making inferences about my character that don't exist. Recently, on a Dead by Daylight collab, there were a lot of viewers that came in and started calling me a bottom without any type of indication whatsoever of that being the case. I considered that an infringement on my consent because I never consented that they could call me that. They didn't even know who I was, and they still did it. Typically speaking, I am okay with anything. Unless you are outright saying on my stream that you want to sexually abuse my character or assault him, I'm typically alright with most things. There is always a limit, however. I have had many viewers on this channel assume that just because I am up here, half-dressed, in BDSM gear, that I am just a fuck toy. And that is not okay. That violates every rule of consent I have. For example, if a viewer flirts with you and you say you don't want that to happen, you have removed consent from the situation, and thus the viewer is obligated to immediately cease all actions of this nature. I'll go so far as to say this. on my channel, and not all content creators will behave this way, anyone who makes me uncomfortable, I'm going to ban. Period. Done. End of sentence. I don't care who you are. You could be somebody that I consider a very good friend. The very moment that you make me uncomfortable because you made a comment about my character or me that I didn't take the right way, you're banned. That's it. There is no appeal. And not all content creators will think that way, but as a viewer, it's your responsibility to understand the content creator you're communicating with and gauge whether or not you have consent to flirt with them. Interactions versus viewers. As a content creator, your burden of consent is much greater than that of your viewers. For you to act sexually explicit to the individuals you are interacting with, you have to make doubly sure that you have their consent to do so. For example, if a viewer is following an R18 streamer, it is implied they may be flirtatious in nature. That does not, however, extend to unsolicited horny DMs outside of said stream, or unsolicited photographs. These acts clearly violate consent, and border on sexual abuse. So, I'm going to be very specific here, and I'm not going to use any names. But I know for a fact that there are streamers I have heard of who will use the engagement of viewers on stream as reasons to intrude on their DMs. And though they may develop sexual relationships after that. That is not okay. Unless both parties have agreed to that sort of thing, or unless somebody has asked to be in someone else's DMs, that is completely inappropriate in my opinion. And I urge you, if that happens to you, to push back against it, to say no, and if the person doesn't accept no, to block them and call them out. Because that is disgusting. In public spaces such as Twitter, this is especially true. Just because someone is following your R18 Twitter account does not give you the right to make advances at them. I'm going to read that again. Just because somebody is following your R18 Twitter account does not give you the right to make advances at them. I want that to be understood. This is a direct, clear violation of the rules of consent. In this instance, consent can be obtained in some of the following ways. And this is specifically referring to the instance I just highlighted. I'm not saying that this is a way to obtain consent. I'm just saying this is a way for an R18 Twitter account to attain consent to interact with their followers. Repeated interaction, i.e. a friend, maybe a close acquaintance that you know is accepting of the interaction. Expressly written consent, i.e. someone saying in a Twitch chat that they're okay with being treated in a certain way. Or informed consent, i.e. a viewer commenting on a sexually explicit poll, wherein it might be clear that some sexual comments might be made in response to the content. Content creators are wholly responsible in making sure that the content they produce, whether it being streams, posts, or videos, is not infringing on the consent of the parties that they provide it to. This last line is extremely important, and I'm going to read this multiple times, because this is my belief as a content creator. It may not be everyone's belief, but it's mine. Making people uncomfortable should never be the goal of an R18 creator. Again, making people uncomfortable should never be the goal of an R18 creator. Ever. Under any circumstances. I don't care what kind of content you peddle. I don't care if your character is a villain. I don't care if your character exploits morally questionable situations. I don't care if your character supports things like dubcon, non-con, whatever. No R18 creator should ever want to make their audience uncomfortable. Because that is a huge red flag. Huge. Alright, now we're going to talk a little bit about exposure. Why does exposure matter? Should consent violations be made, a person may consider themselves to be uncomfortable with the situation, and this may develop into abuse. These repeated abusive interactions may eventually lead to a call-out, or some form of exposure. Exposure is a positive thing, because it lets other community members know who to avoid. The important thing about it, though, is that only that person, or those persons if there's a group spoken about, is responsible for those actions. Exposure is not an indictment of an entire community, but rather a call for people to do better and to understand the implications of another person's actions. Exposure should never be seen as drama, because these are acts committed by one individual against another, typically criminal in nature. The difference between exposure and drama begins and ends at whether or not a person's boundaries have been infringed upon. Exposure is what has happened the last 2 days in the Vtuber community. Some people were hurt, and they wanted to expose that so that other people knew and didn't get hurt. Drama is what happened this week with the Vtuber tag. That's drama. That's not exposure. That is not a call out. That is drama. Just so that we're clear. When should you expose? A person may consider exposing another individual under the following conditions. A crime was committed, i.e. sexual assault. Most call-outs that have been written recently all are about crimes. Sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual molestation. I wasn't going to talk about it in this because it's not relevant, but yeah. A relationship was violated, i.e. adultery/cheating. An arrangement was made and somebody broke it, i.e. a dom not obeying their sub safe word. Person feels uncomfortable by the acts of another and seeks to warn, i.e. sexually aggressive comments, acts, or messages which may have made someone feel less than human or violated. How should you expose somebody? Typically speaking, a call-out may be written using Google Docs to provide evidentiary proof of actions, or a twit longer for a shorter story. In all situations, a call-out/exposure should not be made unless the person has clear evidence of the acts they wish to discuss. This can be in the form of screenshots, messages, etc. Without proper evidence, your call-out may be refuted by somebody who knows the individual and is close to them, or the message may be misconstrued. Remember, call-outs will always create an emotionally charged situation. You want to write yours in such a way that even the most distraught person will understand that someone did something wrong, regardless of how close they are to them. Most importantly, do not lie, edit, or omit information. Use only information that you can verify, and try to refrain from utilizing word-of-mouth examples. Lies, omission, or manipulating information such as cutting screenshots together in a call-out will immediately shred any validity the document has and negatively impact your reputation. I don't know how to put this any more clearly. If you write a call-out for the purpose of defaming another individual, you deserve to have your reputation suffer. Manipulating a community for the sake of making somebody suffer for actions they did not commit is a horrible thing. A person should not make a call-out themselves. This is to avoid details being lost in the moment due to emotional distress or memory flaws. Preferably, ask a close friend whom you trust, or someone you're friends with who is removed from the situation to either proofread your call-out or to help you write it. They can even help with collecting evidence. Callouts are typically public documents. Make sure that nobody can edit them. You can edit permissions on Google Docs to ensure only you have the rights to change the information. Click Share, go down to Get Link, click Change to anyone with the link, and make sure Viewer is selected and not Commenter or Editor. If Editor is selected, you have given anyone who views that document the right to edit it. If Commenter is selected, you have given anyone who reads that document the right to comment on it. You can select Editor during the time that the callout is made, but make sure to edit those permissions before posting to avoid someone else changing the information. Once created, your callout can be posted to Twitter or to a social media you're comfortable with. It may even be posted in a private Discord. I recommend that before posting, you have someone else read it first to make sure your message is clear, concise, and will not be misconstrued. The reason for this is because when we write these callouts, typically we're doing it in a very heightened emotional state. In an emotional state, we often forget details, we often forget evidence, and we often make we often word things in a certain way that may be different from how we intended it to come out. Before you write your call out, I urge you to try and calm down a little bit so that the information you write won't be colored by the emotional state you're in. Because you don't want someone to read your call out and think that you're just angry about something. You want somebody to read your call out and realize you have been hurt. Alright, to conclude, abuse callouts are not drama. They are not indictments, and they are not calls for one population of people to take responsibility. They are accounts of a person or a group of people's actions toward a specific individual, making a call for change and recognition. Callouts are typically made to warn of bad behaviors or to recognize bad actions. By practicing good consent rules, you can avoid becoming part of this growing trend, and also make sure that your audience is comfortable with how you present your content and how you interact with them. It is my hope that by creating this presentation, people in the community will better understand why it matters to make sure you have proper consent before posting unwanted sexual gestures, advances, posts, or media. Alright, now I'm going to open the chat to questions that anybody might have. But before I do that, I have a couple of questions that were given to me over Discord and also over Twitter. So if you have a question, you can write it into chat and I'll answer it. But right now, I'm going to go through these 7 questions first, and then I'll get to the chat questions. Question 1. What, especially as a lewd tuber, is okay to say to your audience versus what isn't consent-wise? Where do you draw the line? Personally, I draw the line at anything that involves actual sexual content. For example, sexual penetration or sexual acts. I'll say all manner of things with flirting as far as just talking about kinks or talking about myself or just talking about, you know, like just general comments like stepping on someone, etc. But I will never say something on stream like talking about fucking someone or talking about having someone fuck me. I might say that about like a visual novel character, but you're not going to see me say it to somebody in chat or like a collab partner or anything. That's where I draw the line. Other people are going to have their own exceptions. Personally speaking, I don't think you should ever say those things to somebody that you're interacting with, unless you know them. Now, if you know like a friend or something like that, it might be okay to say something like that. But if it's just something completely random, if it's just someone you don't even know, don't say it. How do you ask for consent? Well, the PowerPoint's gone through a lot of different ways that you can ask for consent. The easiest way is literally just to ask, is this okay? Are you okay with this? Do you want to stop? Do you think we should change what we're doing? How are you feeling about this? Those are all good ways to ask for explicit consent. For informed consent, that's a little bit harder. Informed consent, a content creator might use polls for, or they might use announcements. Like I announce a lot of stuff on Discord, for example. They might use ads, they might use teasers, they might use promotions. There's a lot of different ways to do informed consent. Explicit consent isn't asking. Explicit consent is more like an inference. Nonverbal cues, for example, are implicit consent. Not exactly expressly said, but they are done to the point where a reasonable person could understand them. And those are some good examples. When is it appropriate to DM someone when they give you permission? If a person does not give you permission to DM them, do not do so. They can do that through a tweet, they can do it on a stream, or you can do it just because you guys were vibing. But do not just randomly DM something to somebody that's sexual in nature just because you thought they'd like it. Ever. That is a horrible violation of consent. What is considered the line when it comes to exposures? This is hard because everyone is going to have a different attitude on when something should be called out. In my opinion, anything that is not a crime in terms of a social crime, meaning you infringed on someone's personal boundary, or a legal crime, is when you should call someone out. Everything under that line is drama. You can make call-outs about drama. You can make twit-longers about drama. But drama is a very specific thing that's about one person, or like about two people. It's not really a community warning thing. When you aren't involved in the situation that someone else is exposing, is it okay to say what you think about it? How? If you're a close friend, yes. If you know the person, if you know how they were affected, and if you have the details about the situation, it is okay to say what you think. It's okay to insert your point of view. If you are random Joe from the sandwich shop happening on the call out after work one day, it is not okay to say what you think about that situation. You can comment. You can say, I'm sorry this happened to you. But nobody wants to hear your point of view. Nobody cares about it. My personal belief is that if something doesn't add something to a conversation, don't say it. There's no reason to say it. What is the difference between active consent and continuous consent? Very good question. Active consent is when you have given somebody permission to do something. For example, if I ask somebody if I can touch their arm and they say yes, that's active consent. They have actively given me consent to touch their arm. If I continue to touch their arm repeatedly without checking to see if it's still okay and they look visibly discomforted, that's continuous consent, and most of the time continuous consent does not apply. A lot of spouses like to use the term continuous consent in terms of relationship, for example with sexual activities. A partner might say, hey, she was okay with this once, so she's okay with this still. That's not necessarily true. Unless you talked about a situation and determined that that partner is still okay with what's going on, there's a chance she changed her mind. Or like in the example I used earlier of the lewd relationship where somebody exchanges nudes, don't talk to somebody for 5 months, and then just assumes that the consent is still there. Personally, if you don't talk to me for 5 months, I don't want to see nude pictures of you. I don't give a shit. Why would I want to? Again, this is something that's going to be specific to the individual. But generally speaking, there is no such thing as continuous consent. There is no rule anywhere that says if somebody doesn't say no, it means they still consent to it. That doesn't exist. That is a manufactured lie that is created by many media situations, including television shows, movies, music, video games, etc. It doesn't exist. Don't just automatically assume that somebody's okay with something every time. Also, if you're in the BDSM scene, a mark of a good dom is to check with your sub to see if they're okay with things. Believe it or not, if you just continue to think that a sub is okay with actions without checking on them, you are a terrible dom, and you don't deserve your title. How do you determine consent in high emotional situations, such as sexual encounters? That is really difficult, but the best way is to just check. It might be awkward, but asking somebody during a sexual situation if they're okay with something isn't wrong. It's just making sure they're comfortable. It's empathy, if anything else. Assumptions are unempathetic. That shows that you don't care. Enthusiastic consent, like Meow just said, is very important. Enthusiastic consent is when you can tell that somebody clearly is okay with something. I don't want to get the definition of this wrong because it's a term that gets used in a lot of sexual assault cases. So I'm just going to read it I'm just going to read it from the Rain website. Give me a second. Okay, here it is. Okay. So, enthusiastic consent is a newer model for understanding consent that focuses on a positive expression of consent. Simply put, enthusiastic consent means looking for the present of a yes rather than the absence of a no. Enthusiastic consent can be expressed verbally through nonverbal cues such as positive body language like smiling, maintaining eye contact, and nodding. These cues do not necessarily represent consent, but they are additional details that may reflect consent. It is necessary, however, to seek verbal confirmation. The important part of consent, enthusiastic or otherwise, is checking in with your partner regularly to make sure they are still on the same page. This part right here, that last bit, is what we in the BDSM scene call debriefing. It's not really a term that a lot of DOMs recognize. It's kind of a colloquial. But the act of checking with a sub after a scene to make sure that everything that you did is okay is part of that practice. The mark of a good DOM is that regardless of how their personal feelings are, they will always make sure that their sub is comfortable. I don't know how to put it any other way than that. And I know that there's a lot of VTubers in this community, especially in the lewd community, that consider themselves DOMs, mommies, daddies, masters, mistresses, whatever. But so few of them ever take consent into account. At least as far as I can see. Alright, we're done with the questions on the slide, so I will get to Heikate's question now. How do you determine consent when you don't spot visual indicators such as a voice chat? Very, very complicated situation. My best advice for this would be that if it's a voice chat between two individuals, you can still ask. Even if you don't physically see each other, you can still ask the question. Mel asks me at least 940 times a day if I'm okay. Doesn't matter what I'm doing. She still asks. We could just be watching a TV show and she will still ask the question. It's never wrong to ask. It might be awkward if it's in a group. If it's in a group, I encourage you just sidebar the chat, message the person, hey, is this okay? Are you okay with me flirting with you like this? Are you enjoying this? Those are all good questions to ask. More specifically, you can also ask them if they're uncomfortable. Hey, is this making you uncomfortable? Do you not like how I did this? Is me flirting with you not okay? Those are some of the ways that I would do it. Honestly, it's really hard over voice chat because you don't see the person, so you can't use implied consent. You can use tone of voice. If a person's tone of voice sounds like they're enjoying it, you can go off of that, but really it's just safer to ask. You can't read anyone's minds over a voice chat, so it's asking is always a good practice, even if you have to sidebar the person. Okay, now I want to talk about some situations of consent that are a little less gray. Or, sorry, a little more gray. So, when you ask somebody to have sex, and if they say no to you, but you keep asking, or you keep implying that you want to do something sexual with them, despite them already having said no, you're engaging in what is known as coercion. Coercing someone into a sexual encounter is a huge violation of consent, but it's a very difficult to see and label one. This is probably the biggest thing that happens in the VTuber community. When you repeatedly egg on an interaction where you know that somebody doesn't want the encounter, but you keep pushing for it, that's coercion. Anytime that person says yes, they've said yes under coercion, and yes, this is a crime. Socially speaking, this is not a crime, but in terms of sexual encounters, this is a crime. you can be put to jail for this. Dubious consent is what's known as dubcon. It's pretty popular in fandoms. I need to find a definition for it that actually, like, is reliable and not on Reddit or something. So dubious consent, there's, like the article says, dubious consent in real life, it doesn't really exist. If there's any doubt about consent and you engage in sexual intercourse with somebody, that's just rape. It's never going to be seen as anything else but a crime. And if you continue engaging with someone sexually and you're not sure if they consented, you've committed sexual abuse or sexual molestation. Both of those are crimes. In fiction, it's a little bit different. In fiction, dubious consent is when you can't really tell if the sexual action has happened with consent. It looks like there might be consent, but you're not really sure because it also kind of looks like one party might have forced the other into sex. And there's some sign, like the article says, that the other party doesn't want to. Specifically highlighting here that they're desiring it and they want it, but they don't want it. It's a difficult thing to label in real life. But I'll put the definition in chat just so it's had. This is a very subjective thing because in a drawing, in writing, well, in writing, dubious consent is a lot clearer. But in drawing, not so much. It's very difficult to nail down when it comes to artwork and stuff like that because typically speaking, when you see like fan art and stuff, you don't really see a before and after. You just see the moment. So it's really hard to gauge what's happening. And that's all I'm going to say on it. Because dubious consent in real life is just rape. If you have any doubts whatsoever that a person has consented to an activity and you still do it, you have committed rape. That's just how it is. When you ask to consent, do you just ask it right off the bat? Because I'm a person who doesn't ask those types of questions at the wrong time and such. It's okay to ask right off the bat. I mean, personally, my motto is anytime anything becomes sexual, that's when I start asking. Unless it's clear that I have consent already, that's when I will start asking. The thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to prevent your anxiety about asking the question to lead you to not doing it. Because then you don't really know. And if the person never consented to it and it still happens, you're at fault. Regardless of how you felt. That's just how it is. Like I said, Mel asks me 900 times a day if I'm okay. It doesn't matter if I'm actually upset. She still asks. There's no wrong time to ask a question about consent. I've interrupted ERP before just to ask people if they're still consenting to it. Like, yeah, it might be awkward, but I still want to know. Consensual non-consent versus dubious consent. I'm going to have to look up another legal definition here. Alright, so consensual non-consent is an exploration of power and the eroticization of completely giving up all power and putting oneself completely in the hands of another. This is basically what we refer to as power play, kind of. My opinion on this, I'm okay with it if I know someone well enough. Like, if I am very well versed in a person's limits, I can completely understand giving up power and control in that situation. I've done it myself. I write about this. So I'm familiar with how it works. If it's somebody that you really don't know though, this is kind of a gray area to me, and if it was somebody that I like knew nothing about, I would consider this a red flag. Personally, that's me. That's just how I do things. Reading on further. Here we go. Consensual non-consent describes engaging in behaviors that may include role-playing non-consensual behaviors or may involve negotiating sexual behaviors where one partner agrees to give up consent during certain behaviors or relationships. For example, this can involve individuals who describe their partner or potential partner that they fantasize about being kidnapped and raped, and the partners agree to enact this as a roleplay scene in real life in order to fulfill the desired fantasy. CNC describes the manner in which the individuals consensually negotiate in advance what the in-the-moment non-consensual behaviors in roleplay would involve. Consensual non-consent represents a form of individuals putting responsibility and control in the hands of another person and inviting them to push the individual beyond their limits or to take responsibility for overcoming the submissive's internal obstacles to engaging in desired behaviors. Consensual non-consent, in essence, reflects an extreme form of eroticization of powerlessness. Yeah, so I just go back to, this is something that I would only consider okay with someone I know well. I think if a Dom was to do this to me and didn't make sure that they understood my limits first, I would consider this very concerning. Within the context of a consensual relationship, I can see how this would be interesting. This is typically the model used in like writing, because very few writers will go into the ins and outs of whether or not consent has been made in a scene. I know in my shorter pieces, I've always written that consent is always implied regardless, but in these types of situations, it's a big gray area. I'm learning a lot right now. I'm thinking a lot about what I say now. Not that I've ever done any of this, just made me a bit more understanding. That's good. It made me think about it too. Yeah, I'm a person that has social anxiety, and sometimes my brain doesn't register when I'm in certain situations and such. Plus, I am a person that lets the other individual let me know if I'm making them uncomfortable or not. So on that subject, I wouldn't leave it up to them. If you are unsure, I would always ask. I would never leave it up to the other person to let you know if they're uncomfortable, because that other person may also have social anxiety and they might not do it for the same reason. The difference is, if you don't ask, that's one thing. But if they don't let you know they're uncomfortable because they were anxious, it's going to be your fault. Just think about how you want to parse that in your own mind. Agreed to my safe words are always important in BDSM. Bar none. There is no exception. If your Dom doesn't use a safe word, you need to run away. If your Dom doesn't respect your safe word, you need to run away. And it's good to think about how people interact with you too, not just how you interact with them, like what's okay. I'm still trying to learn that type of social skills. Good thing my anxiety gives me the need to have constant reassurance. I think it's good practice. It might give you less anxiety to just ask, because then you won't be left in the dark on what you're doing something wrong or not. Because from the other perspective, anxious people might not feel powerful enough to say they're uncomfy, so it's both responsibilities, and not just one, I think. Yeah, this won't work unless there's 100% trust between all partners. But in that case, you pretty much know what you can do, so don't really need it. Yeah. Yep. And there are safe gestures. A lot of Doms will assign gestures as well as safe words in kink scenes. I am one of those Doms. I use gestures and safe words. I write about Dom using gestures and safe words too. If anybody has any final questions, I will answer them. I don't care what they are. This is about learning. It's not about shaming, and it's not about exposing what somebody doesn't know. The purpose of this is to change behaviors and to teach. So, any question that you have, no matter how small, I will answer. Well, if nobody has any questions, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to provide some links. Alright, so first of all, I'm going to provide the website for the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, otherwise known as RAIN. They are what I used to formulate some of this PowerPoint presentation. I also used some legal websites and some articles as well. And I'm also going to provide, because part of this conversation is to elevate victim voices, I would like to provide the links to the original callouts which inspired this. And if you have not read them, I urge you to do so, because this is important. The only way to police our community is by making people know that these acts are not okay. And I'm going to challenge everybody that watched this. If you see somebody on Twitter If you follow somebody on Twitch that's employing these actions, push back against them. Do not just let them go. I don't care what title they use to address themselves as. If a person calls themselves a master or a dom or a mommy or whatever and doesn't want to practice consent, they're a fake. They are a fraud. And that is just how it is. There is no other way around it. I've been watching VTuber behaviors for a long time as a Vtuber. I'm not going to make any names. I'm not going to call anybody out. I'm not going to reference any particular instance. But I am going to say that largely I'm extremely disappointed by the Vtuber community. Because most of them just assume that no matter what they do, everybody who follows them is going to be okay with it. And that's just not how it is. Titles are only relevant to their interaction with you. I've come across so many doms that get haughty about me being submissive, but ultimately they aren't my dom, nor are they yours. Just because of how you identify does not mean anyone else is entitled to you or your consent. Exactly. And there are plenty of doms in this community who are going to assume just because you are submissive that you have to answer to them. It's not specific to the VTuber community, but there are pretenders in this community. Absolutely. On that subject, I want to say one more thing. My branding is BDSM. It's what I've chosen to have the majority of my content be focused around. But under no circumstances do I claim ownership of anybody who follows me. I own Mel. Mel is my submissive. I have kink friends. Citrus being one of them. But, aside from those people, I do not own any of you. And you do not have to answer to me. I keep things in character on Twitter just because that's my brand. And it's totally fine if you want to play along with it. I don't mind at all. I'll play along with it too. But I'm not your dom. So, you don't have to feel like I am. And hell, even I get things wrong. So, if you feel like I'm doing something that infringes on your consent, call it out. It doesn't matter who it is. Just call it out. Alright. That's it. That's all. Our presentation is done. Oh, thank you, Yui. I appreciate it. It seems that these kinds of lewd tubers like the aesthetic of domination and not really the practice. That is exactly how I feel about it, Hekate. There are so many people that use BDSM as a branding without actually caring about what it contains. And it bothers me. It really annoys the shit out of me. But again, that's a topic for another day. This presentation, I'm going to make it available in my Discord. I was debating whether or not I want to post it publicly on Twitter. I don't think I should. It has nothing to do with the fact that I think someone would question what I've written on it. It has everything to do with the fact that I think somebody might attack it. And I don't really want to open that door. But we do plan to highlight the stream. I have Mel making notes on the stream to create clips so we can post them on Twitter, TikTok, and just try and get some of this stuff out so that people can understand that these behaviors are not okay. But I challenge everybody that watched this today to push back against what you see that is not okay. And if someone ever makes you uncomfortable, regardless of how they do it, say so. And if they don't respond, then call it out. Alright. We're going to take a small break. I need water. And I have all kinds of things to do in chat there. And then we'll be back with Elden Ring. So, I will see you in just a few short minutes.